You don't need more money, you need a better plan. Now, this is the motto that drives our company as well as the content on this channel. I think there is a ton of value hidden in most retiree situations, and a better plan is what you need to unlock that given value. But what exactly does a better retirement plan actually mean? Well, in this video today, we're going to talk about 4 must-have parts of a retirement plan that will lead to better decision-making in your situation. Now, this is not an all-encompassing list, but these are the 4 pillars that I think every retirement plan must have. Let's get into it. The very first thing, and one of the most important things we need as part of our retirement plan, is a way to simulate the future. After all, that's kind of the whole point in planning. When we look at what the future might be in terms of a very good trial, an average trial, or a very bad trial, we want to make sure our retirement plan stands up in the face of all of those future scenarios. And so one of the biggest mistakes I see with either retirees or other advisors is just poorly planning for what the future might look like. They either use historical returns or they use something like the left-hand side of the screen here, where they just use a static growth rate. And the problem with both of those situations is the future likely will not look like history, and the future will certainly not look like some static growth rate. We need to be thinking about things like sequence of return risk, where the order of returns really matters in terms of withdrawals. And we can do all of this by using something called a Monte Carlo. All a Monte Carlo is you take a set of assumptions and you randomize those assumptions moving through time. And so what you'll see are very good trials, what we expect to be more of an average trial, and then a very poor trial. And again, as we start to simulate our plan based on our goals and things like that, we can start to see what our probability of success is after looking at the wide distribution of outcomes we may actually have. Now, let me give you an example why a Monte Carlo and simulated returns is so important by showing you the risk of sequence of return. So on the screen, what I have is a classic 60-40 portfolio. And I'm using a cherry pick period for this example. The reason this is cherry picked is because we're looking at a 60-40 portfolio from 1973 to 1993. And this is cherry picked because a 60-40 portfolio did quite well during this period, growing by an average return of 10.3% for that 20-year period. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at returns from 1973 to 1993, and then we're going to look at returns in reverse. So basically changing the order of returns. And what we see here, if we're not withdrawing anything from our portfolio, and we simply start with $100,000 and simply grow that through time with no contributions or no withdrawals, sequence of return risk doesn't matter. From 1973 to 1993, that $100,000 grows into $720. And if we reverse that and start in 1993 and go backwards, that $100,000 grows into $720 and takes just a slightly different path. But where sequence of return risk really starts to come in is when we start taking systematic withdrawals. Now, for the sake of this example, let's say that we use a 5% withdrawal rate and we grow that for inflation moving through time. Well, interestingly enough, if we now look at taking withdrawals on an ongoing basis and we start in 1973 with this balanced portfolio, well, our retirement fails in less than 20 years. The reason being is because there were some significant losses right at the beginning of this period. If we flip this though and start in 1973 and move backwards, so just changing the order of returns, interestingly enough, that $100,000 grows to $302,000. So this is why we need to be using a Monte Carlo and not just historical periods or static growth. We want to simulate enough future outcomes that we have a pretty good idea of where the sequence of return risk comes in, and so we can start to overcome that in other areas of our plan. Now on the screen, I have 2 charts to just show how a Monte Carlo and looking at the Monte Carlo data can help provide added context to your plan and thus position to have better peace of mind throughout your retirement. The first is one that I'm talking a lot right now with a lot of clients. For instance, if you just retired and now we're seeing a market crash at the beginning of your retirement, you may be thinking, wow, this seems like the absolute worst timing. My plan might be irreversibly affected because of this downturn. Well, I really like to dive into certain individual trials that start with a pretty bad first 5 or 10 years and just show what the outcomes of some of those trials might have been. And oftentimes what we see if we're building the plan correctly is that it's not that big of an adjustment altogether. For instance, on the top chart, I'm showing a specific trial where this retiree started out their retirement 2 consecutive years in a row where their portfolio lost more than 15%. And yet, despite this, because of offsetting later in their retirement, as well as creating enough safety to overcome needing to pull from investments that are down that much, Their assets within this Monte Carlo still were expected to be grown by 35%. On the bottom half of the screen then, when we talk about where do we start to see failures within this Monte Carlo, I find this is a very helpful analysis. For instance, I want to know what return should we expect from our portfolio when we start to see those failures. It might be a relatively high return that's just a very volatile return leading to sequence return risk, but it might also be a very low return. And maybe at that point, we're comfortable assuming that risk. Now, interestingly enough, what we'll see is that most of the failures come when this person is earning less than 4% on their money. For instance, out of the 15 trials with an average 4% return, only 2 of those trials were failures. And a lot more of those failures happen when we started looking at returns less than 4%. And so that might be a type of situation where that retiree is comfortable assuming that risk of only having a 93% probability of success because most of the failures come when they're earning a fairly modest return. Any way you slice it, a Monte Carlo will help you make better decisions in the future. The problem is, if we just stop here, a Monte Carlo is not a plan. This is not enough. Because once we build that plan, what happens is we sometimes enter into what I call the cycle of worry. And that's where this second must-have comes in. Once we have an initial probability of success, we want to now put that probability of success underneath stress, overcome the cycle of worry. We have an initial probability of success from a Monte Carlo, let's say. And now there's a hot breaking news story, and that news story is something that we really don't have control over. For instance, maybe there's a politician that wants to end the Social Security system. And because of that, because you're looking at your retirement plan, you think, I have quite a bit of income that's being planned to come from Social Security. What if they do cut Social Security? Will that completely ruin my plan? Will I have to adjust my spending down? And the problem with this cycle of worry, with things we can't control, is that worry starts to infect the most important parts of our life. When we're fishing with our grandchildren, we're worried about what these politicians are going to do to the Social Security system. Or it's keeping us up at night, preventing us from getting a good night's sleep. Now, because of this, you might make changes based on emotion rather than data, and then you find yourself, the next hot news story, entering into this cycle of worry again. So what you can do to overcome this is put stress back on your plan and see how your plan holds up. You know that if Congress doesn't do anything by 2034, the Social Security Trust Fund is set to run out, and payroll taxes will only cover about 79 cents on the dollar for every benefit promised. So we would see about a 21% cut if there are no other changes to the Social Security system. Well, how does that cut affect your retirement? Well, with a stress test, we can upload that into your plan and simply cut Social Security benefits starting in 2034 by 20% or 21%. Now, in this person's situation, they started with a 93% probability of success and were only cut to an 89%. And so it wasn't that drastic change in their situation. And so does it deserve the amount of worry that they had before without having a specific answer for how it would affect their retirement plan? Now, there are a lot of stress tests that you can start to build into your plan, such as higher inflation, higher taxes. What happens if the market crashes early in retirement? What happens if I or my spouse live longer than expected or one of us passes away sooner? All of these things are things we can test inside of a plan and gain an answer on. And that answer helps you with peace of mind in retirement. Retirement plan must-have number 3 is a forward-looking tax plan. For many of you, taxes are going to be one of your largest, if not your largest, expense. And so when we think about improving our retirement plan, saving on taxes is one of the most important adjustments that we can make. Well, how do we know how much we can save on taxes if we don't know what our tax burden will be? Now, I'm trying to be cognizant of, in this video, not making this an advertisement for Safeguard. And so I don't want to specifically go through all of the ways that we develop these must-have parts of your plan. Instead, I want to talk about this a little bit more generally. But really, what a forward-looking tax plan is supposed to do is have an estimate in terms of what taxes will look like moving forward in the future. Now, outside of Congress making huge changes to tax laws, this is a lot easier than most people think. Tax brackets generally increase by inflation moving through time. And then we also want to use the Monte Carlo, that is the first must-have as part of your retirement plan. And we want to simulate investment performance that will then simulate the tax liabilities. What I mean here is oftentimes you'll see a forward-looking tax graph that looks like this, where we start to fill in your income need from your retirement accounts moving through time. And then later in retirement, when you reach your early 70s, we start to look at how big of a liability required minimum distributions are. Now, throughout looking at this tax graph, we're trying to see what tax hurdles our income pushes us up into. For instance, there's a number of these on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, if you're not sure what some of these tax traps are, simply go to YouTube, go to the search bar, and search Safeguard Wealth Management and then the tax hurdle. So Safeguard Wealth Management, Social Security Tax Torpedo. And you'll see a number of videos that explain this tax hurdle and help you gain some understanding about how to avoid this tax hurdle moving forward in the future. But really, our goal here is try to even out taxes over time. Not have some very low taxes early in retirement and extremely high taxes later in retirement, but rather make the best tax decisions throughout our retirement. This forward-looking tax plan should then be something that drives nearly every tax strategy within your retirement. Everything from Roth conversions to qualified charitable distributions to donor-advised funds to even tax-efficient withdrawal strategies. Now, the last must-have is something that we call a liquidity plan, could otherwise be referred to as an income plan. And so up to this point, each must-have as part of your retirement plan has served a purpose. That Monte Carlo simulates future returns and gives you a probability of success score. A forward-looking tax plan obviously helps you save on taxes and make better decisions from that standpoint. And a liquidity plan is meant to drive a lot of the investment decision-making inside of your plan. For instance, the main thing that changes from when we go from working to retirement is now we need income from our portfolio at different phases in our retirement. Well, how much income do we need and what time horizon do we have on that money? Well, that's exactly what a liquidity plan is supposed to help you figure out. For instance, we might estimate that we need in 2045 $50,000 from our portfolio. Well, that is money that we don't need to plan for liquidity right now. We can wrap that up in more aggressive investments because we have a very long time horizon on the need for that money. But if we look at the money we'll need next year in 2023, we need to have that money relatively safe. We don't want to be pulling from a market that's down, let's say 30, 40, 50% potentially. So generally what we want to do with a liquidity plan is we want to look at your income goal. We want to add in any taxes and healthcare, those very important expenses. And then we want to subtract out guaranteed income, whether that's Social Security income, pension income, annuity income, all of that would fit into this category. This will give us a number that is basically our portfolio need. Now, this is where there's a lot of philosophical differences that may come from you or whoever's planning for your retirement. How much should we have in a safe bucket that has no risk? How much should we have in an intermediate bucket that maybe has some slight risk but will offer a higher yield? And then how much should we have in a more risky bucket? Well, this is exactly what a liquidity plan will help you decide. And the reason this liquidity plan methodology is better than the traditional advising methodology, in my opinion, is because traditional advising will typically use model portfolios. Now that you're retired, you should either be a 50-50, 60-40, or 70-30 mix. But really, I think your plan should decide that target allocation. The traditional model is very risk-tolerant focused. And the problem is your risk tolerance will change moving through time. For instance, I'm guessing a lot of you were more risk tolerant at the start of the year than you are currently right now after seeing a market downturn. And then the traditional model will be very income generating focused. So for instance, if we need $20,000, we might need to put $1 million in a bond that generates a 2% interest in order to get that $20,000 per year. It's focused on the income generation. Instead, what likely makes more sense is simply clearing up enough room for those $20,000 withdrawals and having more in a stock portfolio. We expect to earn more from that stock portfolio than we do from an income generating portfolio. And so instead, what we want to do with a liquidity plan is we want to have a portfolio that's designed based on our plan. We want it to be liquidity and yield focused, maintaining liquidities through time, but outside of that, trying to gain the highest expected yields. Now, because of this, we end up being more of a total return focus rather than an income generating focus, which ends up being the correct decision. And then risk tolerance is still a layer, but a second layer. We want to start with how much does your plan say you need in safety? This doesn't mean that that's the safety we're going to move forward with. We may increase it for a risk tolerance, reducing volatility standpoint, but at the very least, we have a reason we're making these given decisions rather than just picking a traditional portfolio out of a hat. Because we have specificity within that liquidity plan, our research shows that it delivers significantly better outcomes on an ongoing basis. Now, this was designed to be a little bit more of a general video. I wanted to talk through some important parts of a retirement plan, not get into the nitty-gritty detail, but have this be something where you can ask your advisor if they can add in some of the things that we talked about in this video to your plan. If you're somebody who's interested in seeing a little bit more detail on how you set up a liquidity plan or forward-looking tax plan, let me know in the comments below. Also, if you're someone that wants to dive a little bit more into some of those tax hurdles that we discussed in the forward-looking tax plan section, click on this video right here where we talk about 8 important tax traps that you need to be thinking about on an ongoing basis as you plan your retirement plan. Thanks for watching. Always remember, you don't need more money, you need a better plan.